Welcome back to the Zero Trust Journey, everyone. I'm your host, Zach Pugh. Today, I've got Victor Monga with me hosting as well, and we have special guest Jason Garbus joining us. Jason, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Zach. Thanks, Victor. I am looking forward to a great discussion today.
Likewise, likewise. Can you give our viewers a little bit of context on your background as one of the OGs in the Zero Trust space?
I'm old. I don't know if I'm an OG, but I have been doing this for quite a while. Yeah. So if I'll kind of work backwards, right? So today, what I'm doing today is I'm independent consultant. I have a firm I created focused on helping enterprises define and execute on effective zero trust strategies. So I work with enterprises, security leaders. I do some work with vendors, but mostly enterprises to really help them understand what zero trust is, but also follow a structured step-by-step framework for actually making it real. And I really do this with a bias toward delivering business value. Now, how did I get into this? Well, I have a number of roles in the industry. One is I'm a co-chair of the Zero Trust Working Group at the Cloud Security Alliance. So I've had that role for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. I've been involved in that working group for close to 10 years. I joined it back when it was, in fact, called the Software Defined Perimeter Working Group, before Zero Trust had really taken the industry by storm. So in those roles, as a volunteer and then as a leader, I've had the opportunity, and I really feel blessed to have been part of this wave of Zero Trust and to learn so much from practitioners, from other thought leaders in the industry, and folks like Chase and John Kindervag, who really created and promoted Zero Trust. I also, prior to this role, I also worked for a vendor, a Zero Trust network access vendor, as chief product officer. So in that role, of course, I work with customers, and I was responsible for setting the direction for that product. And that really helped me, number one, learn about a lot of this, but also have the opportunity to work with a lot of both private sector and public sector customers and prospects in the industry. I do a lot of speaking on this at trade shows virtually, and sometimes I feel like it's all Zero Trust all the time, but the mission is so important, that's okay. Oh, and I've written 2 books on Zero Trust as well.
Awesome. Well, great background. Let's dive into that book. You wrote a book, Zero Trust Security and Enterprise Guide. What motivated you to write that, and what key takeaways are you hoping that readers absorb from that book?
So what I realized through the roles that I mentioned, when this was back in really 2019, 2020, was that I had a lot to say about Zero Trust, and I found myself having in-depth conversations with security practitioners. And it's amazing that even in an hour-long conversation, there's so much that's left unsaid that I felt like I really needed to write this down and get it out there, so that, number one, it forces me to think a little bit more rigorously about it, but number two, that it's also more broadly available. So I teamed up with my co-author, Jerry Chapman, who has a lot of experience in the industry, and he and I had met through a group called the Identity Defined Security Alliance. So we teamed up and wrote that book. And, it really, of course, forced us to collaborate and think about and talk to a lot of people to try to coalesce our thinking. And we got that out there. And that was published a few years ago. I've gotten great feedback on it. It sparked a lot of good conversations.
Yeah, it's a great book. I would recommend everyone pick up a copy, take a look.
Yeah, Jason, I have joined recently Cloud Security Alliance Zero Trust Working Group as well. I've been with CISA from past decade, SoCal chapter leader as well for a few years. So let's talk about the working group. When you are actually working in the working group, you have smart people, subject matter experts who are actually partnering with you. What are the key challenges you have heard from them to adopt Zero Trust? Like why enterprises are still struggling, or some of them are still struggling to adopt Zero Trust?
The part of it is that Zero Trust is a security strategy. It's really a mindset, and that it should really inform everything you as a security leader do and think about in your industry. And if we zoom out for a minute and we think about this, first of all, practically everything that our enterprises do is digital or digitized nowadays. There's very little that isn't. And obviously there has to be an IT infrastructure to support that. And that, we all know how complicated that is. And then security is this layer around that. And what we have to do as security professionals in our enterprises is understand this really complex IT infrastructure and the processes that people are using, and then build a model around it that says, I see what's going on, I understand what's going on, and now I have tools and technologies to determine and enforce what's allowed and what's not allowed. So information security inherently in our enterprises today is an incredibly complex problem. And most enterprises don't do a great job at it, as we know. And what Zero Trust does is I think it simplifies this, right? No one's going to say it's simple, but it does simplify it. And the reason that people struggle is that it's due to the inherent complexity of their underlying environment, as well as, in general, a lack of rigor and lack of visibility into the processes and the devices and the systems on the network. So a lot of times people get overwhelmed. And that's why when I work with enterprises, I say, look, this stuff's really complicated, but let's just take it one step at a time. We've got some really good tools out there. We have maturity models that we can use. We have frameworks that say, let's just take this thing step by step. And really an emphasis on what I believe works is looking at your business assets, sometimes what's called a protect surface, one at a time, and start to build out policies for those that you can then enforce in your environment, start to deliver value, both security value and business value quickly. And then turn that into a roadmap that says, okay, I want to do this. I can only do this today. And I need to deploy some new technology or turn on some new capabilities. So if you look at it that way, it actually leads you to a very incremental process or program in your enterprise that can deliver value quickly and help you break this thing down into manageable pieces.
Yeah, I think John Kindermark says it's hard, it's not complex. So that's what it is. At the end of the day, as an organization, it's really hard to actually go with that culture change, mind shift, where now I have to really apply the principles of zero trust and not just give the root access or admin access to everybody.
Yes, exactly. And it is a cultural shift in some cases. And we have certainly seen places or situations where you run into impediments as a security leader, you feel like you're pushing the rock uphill. And we've seen enterprises where these projects really are not successful for a lot of different reasons. In my mind, a lot of this has to do with the ones that I've seen work are really where the security leaders get out of their comfort zone and they talk to people in the business. They really try to understand what's motivating those individuals. What are the goals or the incentives for the business? And then how do you support that as a security leader? How do you support the enterprise's mission in a way that enables innovation, enables speed, enables growing top line revenue in a way that is secure?
Yeah. So one of the things that we talk about is practical zero trust implementation. And you're talking a little bit about, people, processes, technology, effective communication. So let's just kind of break down your approach there. When you're talking to business leaders, you're trying to convey the importance of zero trust and the reason behind going after it. How are you specifically approaching those conversations to communicate that business value and address all of the elements of zero trust, not just the technology piece or the people piece, but all of them together at once?
I mean, a lot of it has to do with, if I think about this, first of all, I think we're fortunate that we don't have to do a lot of evangelism about zero trust in general. Security leaders generally get it, and it tends to be them nodding their heads. Sometimes we want to help them understand, the way what we think zero trust is, and there's a little bit of a shift there, just to reminding them, hey, this isn't a product, this is a strategy, this is something that you're doing. The connection to business value is really around, I think, opening their eyes to making sure that, to underscore the reason that information security exists in these enterprises to securely enable the mission of the enterprise. And to help people recognize that improving security maturity, which of course zero trust does, and there's some great frameworks to measure that, that's not the primary goal, right? Of course you need to do that, but the primary goal is to securely enable business innovation and the accomplishment of the business mission. And by taking this business asset centric view, it really puts those things at the forefront and helps throughout this conversation and throughout these processes, helps the security leaders better articulate and learn from folks on the business side about what they can improve. And I'll give you an example. I was talking to a pharmaceutical company. This relatively small company, about 1,000 people, not gigantic, based in the United States. So we're talking about zero trust. And I asked, okay, well, what sort of business or technology initiatives are going on? And you'd expect to hear the usual things like, oh, we're doing cloud migration or we're adopting DevOps or things like that. But they said, well, we're going to be expanding to Europe. And I'm like, well, this is perfect because here you are, you got a new geography you're going to. It's a new regulatory environment that's a lot stricter. And it's a great opportunity for the security team to say, hey, I know we're spending millions of dollars on this initiative to open up a new market. Here's how we can support that and make it better, make it faster, reduce our compliance overhead, et cetera.
I think that's a great point for our viewers too. And something we've had a lot of guests mention is tying it back to business value, driving, using security as a driver instead of as a detractor for the business. So I don't think in this vein, zero trust is any different than any other type of security strategy that you're trying to get an organization to adopt. It's all about how communicating the value that you're you're providing to the business and what you're doing to protect their business goals and objectives. Thanks for your insights there.
I think that, one of the things that as we go through these conversations with enterprises, we also help them recognize that in some cases, I would even say in many cases, that they can take some initial steps and improve things without having to deploy new technology. I mean, there was one conversation we had around a pretty standard web application, and they recognize that while the web application talks to a database and they're sitting next to each other in the data center, but there's no firewall, there's no restrictions on the interaction between them, and there's no reason to have that. That's a very static environment. They could put in place a firewall rule or a policy that says, hey, only the web app is allowed to talk to the database on this port for this service. And really easy to do, very low risk, but it's improving their security. It's improving the principle of least privilege, and it gets rid of a potential exploitation of anyone or anything on the network connecting to that database server and exploiting some vulnerabilities. That's a really simple example, but there's lots of them that come up through these projects of people recognizing, oh, we have this capability, we haven't turned it on, or we're not really doing a good job at this. We could just change our process and really start to make some progress here without having to spend money or go through a vendor procurement cycle.
Yeah, and I think understanding and realizing the effectiveness of your current technology stack and your current policies and current procedures, and at the end of the day, what you have currently, instead of just continuing to buy something new on the name of security. I think that's very important. But at the same time, it's very hard to do it objectively. Speaking of that, zero trust maturity model. CISA have it, but you created a zero trust maturity model plus as well. So can you give our audience here and listeners what prompted you to create that, what limitations the CISA ZTMM had, and how does this objectively help organizations see where they are in their zero trust journey?
So the CISA model, I like the CISA model, but it is flawed, as you mentioned. So I've used it a lot, both in working with private sector as well as some U.S. public sector organizations. And through that, sometimes difficult, sometimes painful discussion, I really learned about areas where the CISA model falls short, where it's a little off target, where it's missing certain things. So what really we did over the last couple years of using this in practice and, getting beaten up sometimes and going through this with lots of enterprises to recognize, first of all, that we need to have better definitions around these functions within the CISA model, because CISA actually doesn't define the specific functions. I mean, the functions are the finest grain elements, things like user authentication or device threat protection. So first of all, we define those. Second of all, we recognize there's some gaps. So we added about 8 or so different functions. So things like secure web gateway or secure internet access was not included in the CISA model at all. DLP is barely included in the CISA model, and we think that's a big miss. And some of the functions we felt like were a little bit off target. So for about 20 of them, we actually changed the maturity pathway for this function. So we added things, we tweaked things to make it, we felt, a better fit, to make it clearer, make it easier and also more realistic for enterprises. And we also created a structured way of doing this, where right now, if you just look at the system model, you've got these maturity pathways and it's kind of very nebulous. And we found that for most enterprises, it's very hard for them to look at these maturity pathways and figure out, okay, I got to parse out 2 or 3 threads within there. And, where am I on that? So what we did was we actually took each of those functions and we just translated them into a handful of very specific, easy to understand questions, usually, 2, 3, or 4 for each of the functions. So if I got a sample here on my screen here, I look at devices, right? The policy enforcement and compliance monitoring function. And there's a maturity pathway for it, but it's not really easy to understand. So we broke it down into some simple questions. How are devices configurations reported, managed, and validated for compliance? How are devices managed, patched, and configured? And to what degree does your enterprise make use of device management software? So 3 really simple questions that, number 1, will hopefully be closer to objective than subjective to answer. And number 2, are also designed to spark a focused conversation across the team. And this is one of the real benefits that we see time and time again when we do these, is you're asking questions about a function in the pillar. And by design, you've got people in the room from IT, from security, but also hopefully from outside of that, maybe from the line of business or data or application owners. And what we see a lot is that these groups engaged in conversation where maybe they contradict each other or they learn from each other. We were talking about applications and talking about the application lifecycle. Then we asked about custom applications, and someone said, no, we don't have any custom applications. We just have COTS applications. And someone else said, no, that's not true. We have these applications over here. And the security person said, oh, really? I didn't know that. So they ended up talking about that. They learned that, and they also uncovered that they had some weaknesses around, obviously, the visibility there, but also the security aspects of that. So this structure is designed to make it easy, but also to draw out conversation and collaboration.
In your ZTMM Plus, you use a structured methodology for maturity assessments. Can you elaborate on how this new model helps organizations in assessing their true zero trust state today?
So what we've done is we have a spreadsheet that we put together to guide people through this, as well as a set of slides. So together, what this methodology is designed to do is to allow an organization to run these as a self-assessment without any outside guidance from myself or someone else. It's really designed then. What the structure is it takes you through the functions within each pillar. And then it takes you through each of those questions that you ask the team to foster a conversation about that and lets you then say, okay, this is where we are today, and this is what our target state is for each of those areas. And then there's a graphical representation of that shows where you are to make it clear, to make it easy to communicate to non-technical individuals.
ZTMM Plus defines pillar functions and adds new ones like device lifecycle management, secure internet access. So why is defining these pillar functions important? And how do we how do those new functions address the ever evolving enterprise needs?
So one of the things that we recognized through the experience of doing so many of these was that when you're engaged in these conversations, that these different, we'll call them threads, kind of pop out of this. And these threads tend to be unique enough just through our experience that it makes sense to separate them. So I'll give you a simple example is in the system-based model, they have a user authentication function. And when we talk through this with enterprises, what comes up every single time is a whole side conversation about non-human or non-person entity authentication. And we said, well, of course. And you know what? It's different processes, it's different technology, it's different owners. And that drove us to create a separate function called NPE authentication with its own maturity model. And that just makes a ton of sense, right? Why? Because they're so separate. Number one, you want to have a separate conversation about it. And number two, you're going to have different maturity levels for these things almost by definition. So it makes sense to have those things separate. Secure internet access is another good example. That was omitted from the system model, I would say by design, because in the U.S. federal government, all of their internet access goes through this thing called the Trusted Internet Connection, or TIC. It's basically a SWIG. Obviously, that doesn't exist for enterprises. So we needed to add that in so that it's addressed properly. Finally, DLP is another good example. It was very, very lightly mentioned in the system model, and we felt that was a miss, and it really needed to be talked about separately because data and data security in general is, I'll use the technical term, right? A big giant mess in most organizations. And we really need to call that out so that it can be addressed and talked about properly.
I have one question, and we can double click on that one. Security and access. A lot of the companies that they feel that as long as they have a firewall and they are using HTTPS or 443, that's considered as secure internet access. Do you want to elaborate on what you actually mean when you ask for secure internet access?
Sure. So it's generally the set of functions that today in modern platforms are incorporated into secure web gateway or the part of the SASE suite. So things like DNS filtering, web filtering, sometimes DLP, maybe some combination of remote browser isolation or secure enterprise browser, things that are looking at and preventing outbound access from user devices or the enterprise, to known bad or suspect sites. Sure. So that's that category.
Gotcha.
So let's double click on DLP a little bit. The original module, as you pointed out, it does mention it a little bit, but it's very, very high level. So what did you expand with your DLP coverage in this new model?
So in terms of DLP, what we did was we really tried to boil this down to a couple of very specific questions. So one was simply asking, well, what DLP technologies do you have in place today? Most enterprises do have very little, or they are generally, if I had to generalize, I would say, most of them are looking at things like a Purview or something similar for their unstructured data, and they're just getting started with that. We also asked about what sort of email security they have for looking at outbound email attachments. But the kind of the bigger picture that we added is the notion of data categorization and data inventory management, which in many ways is a foundational precursor for this, because clearly if you don't have any sort of visibility into, I've got this structured data and it's accessed this way, and I've got, all this unstructured data and there's lots of different ways that it's being accessed, it's very hard to have a coherent data loss prevention strategy. So we really expanded on those areas and you end up having, what are often enlightening, if sometimes painful, conversations about the relative immaturity of data classification, data visibility, and data lifecycle in most enterprises. And that's not, I'm not being critical. It's just a fact that most enterprises do have invested in and done a better job with the more technical identity in devices and networks. And they tend to be less mature on the applications and workloads and data for a lot of different reasons.
And that makes sense. On this podcast, almost every time we tend to repeat this, where let's not overcomplicate zero trust, and let's try to break it down to bite size. So, Jason, in your experience, what you have heard, and with numerous engagements you've done to mature zero trust for a lot of organizations and corporations, what do you think the pitfalls usually people fall for when they start their zero trust strategy, or when they tend to start their zero trust journey?
Some of the pitfalls are, I would say, number one, continuing to look at things from a siloed perspective. I like the system maturity model, but the fact that you have these pillars that correspond to functional silos, there is a risk that people will look at that as sequential and as isolated from one another. The worst thing someone can do is say, we're going to start with the first pillar, which is identity, and we're going to do that for 8 months. And then we're going to go to the second pillar, which is devices, and we'll do that for 12 months. So hold on. There is no first pillar, right? It just happens to be that identity is one on the left. And second, you can't do these things sequentially. If you were to do that, you would never get done. You'd never make any progress. You'd never deliver any value. There's a little bit of hyperbole in there. But in general, the right way to do this, and the right way to deliver value quickly, is to force yourself to look across the pillars and say, okay, I have a protect surface, a business asset, some combination of applications and workloads and data. And why am I doing all this work? I'm doing this to define and enforce access policies. And policy says these identities on these devices across these networks are allowed to access these resources under these circumstances. And that forces you to think across those pillars. And it forces you to think holistically, not just from a technology perspective or from a process perspective. And that gives the security team a recognition that, hey, I can create these policies and going to make me kind of step outside of the technology view. And I'll give you an example, right? So really simple access policy, something that every organization has, is something like, I've got a finance application with the web UI. Who should be able to access that? Well, the people on the finance team who are in the employee group and in the finance group in my directory should be allowed to access this if they're on a corporate device. Access policy. That access policy can only work if you have a high degree of confidence that, in fact, the group membership identity system has accurate information and you've got appropriate processes for adding and removing people throughout their identity life. And what that does is it says, okay, I need to make sure that at least for those groups that we have a reliable identity governance processes, identity lifecycle process. And once we do that, then that policy never has to change. But what it does is, where am I going with this, is helps security people realize that you have to look at this stuff holistically. And it doesn't have to be hard, right? We're not saying you have to create the world's most beautiful enterprise identity lifecycle process for every single application and every single user. You can just start with that one group as to improve on that and to make sure you have good and reliable information in there. But once you do that, then that policy is kind of like a set it and forget it type of thing.
So speaking on the topic of just starting out, when you're talking to an organization who you don't quite know where they are in their zero trust journey, they probably are just kind of starting to evaluate where this could go. Where do you start with them? How are you leading them from 0 to 1 on the journey?
So what we do is we have a defined process here that is intentionally pretty lightweight, right? It starts off with an assessment phase. And in the assessment phase, of course, we work with them where they'll do the self-assessment around their zero trust maturity. And that's intentionally designed to be something that can be done in 2 calendar weeks, really not heavyweight, because you want to get it done quickly. You want to even at the sense of saying, well, I'm not going to go super deep on these things, but I want to talk about everything across the board. The second piece of the assessment phase is a very simple organizational readiness. And this is a questionnaire or discussion that can happen in less than an hour. It's where are we in terms of the organizational buy-in and expectations for our Zero Trust initiative? Do we have the people? Do we have the budget? Do we have reporting mechanisms? Do we have a program committee? And what is the organization going to expect from us? So it's a way of balancing out what you're ready to do and what the organization is looking for. Because the last thing you want is to launch an initiative and have your organization say, okay, if you've got an initiative now, you need a steering committee and you need, monthly reports to the board or whatever, and you're not set up for success there. So the assessment phase is deliberately pretty lightweight. And then there's a strategy phase, which again is really where are you going with this? What's the vision? And what should your program committee or steering committee, or sometimes it's called a Jedi Council, what does that look like, right? Who is on that? What's the cadence for it? What are the goals? And then really you get to the heart of it, which is the roadmap, is looking at these business assets, starting to define those. And from that, you're able to map out what can you do today and what's going to need new capabilities in your environment and potentially new technology. And then of course, you get to the execution phase. So those 4 steps are really designed to help organizations get started quickly, think about things in the right way, and not put too much effort into the upfront piece of it. The last thing we want, the thing I hate as a consultant is you're doing a ton of work and you give them like a 50-page report and no one ever looks at it or does anything with it, right? We're really approaching this with a bias toward let's make this, have the right conversations, but turn it into action as quickly as possible.
I like that. One of the things that on the show we talk about is vendor hype. So with Zero Trust, I'm sure you've seen it. Some of the vendors are saying they're Zero Trust certified. Some of the vendors, they're saying that they provide Zero Trust compliance. Some of the vendors, again, out there, which doesn't help, which really doesn't help, because if someone is not clear on what Zero Trust strategy is, they can go buy the Blinky box and thinking and hoping that they have Zero Trust. So have you come across those nuances, and what do you recommend? What do you recommend to our listeners that they don't fall for those?
I think, there certainly are egregiously bad vendors, but I think they're hopefully the exception rather than the rule. I mean, clearly there is no standard, there's no certification that says, yes, we are, Zero Trust Labs listed and deploy our solution and you'll be Zero Trust. And I would encourage enterprises to ask tough questions of vendors who perhaps are getting a little bit too far out there in terms of that. Think the big platform vendors generally, of course, align themselves with Zero Trust, and they generally have a pretty good set of capabilities. But no platform vendor, no matter how big they are, no matter who they are, does everything here. So it really does fall on the enterprise to approach things properly and tie together the processes in their organization around identity governance and deployment of workloads, endpoint management system, or the SIEM, or the SOC team that's doing this, to tie it all together. So part of what I try to do is educate folks to recognize, number one, you're in charge as the enterprise, and you're going to have tools and technology, but this is your vision and your roadmap to execute on, and don't get, I would say, perhaps too constrained by what the vendor says they do and what they're capable of or not capable of.
Yeah, vendors are a tool to moving forward your Zero Trust strategy, but over-reliance on that versus understanding as a business where you need to go. Don't let vendors define that for you, I guess, is where we really go with that, and figure out how you leverage vendors to move forward in your own Zero Trust strategy. I want to wrap up here, Jason. We're approaching the end of our time. One last question for you that I ask all of the guests that appear on the show is, what's one thing that you would ask for our audience to take away from the discussion here and from your experience in Zero Trust?
I think the takeaway is that you as an enterprise absolutely can do Zero Trust, because it's a mindset and a strategy. And recognize that what Zero Trust provides for you is really the combination of all the best practices from a technology, from a process, from a philosophy perspective, all the best practices that we as an industry have developed over the last 25 or 30 years. And there are some great tools out there from vendors that will help you. You don't need those on day one, but what you do need to do is to look at your enterprise and recognize that we're now operating in a very high stakes environment. And it's incumbent upon you to really raise the bar or raise the level of rigor in your organization to make it so that you're much more resilient against ransomware or data breaches, that you have better control over what the heck people are deploying on your network and what the heck services your users are accessing or sending their data to. And it's part of this is, hey, let's grow up a little bit as an industry, and part of it is this is a better way to do it, and you can do it.
Awesome. I think that's a great advice on that. I think we can wrap. Zach, anything you wanna give our audience, and let's thank Jason and our listeners.
Nothing from closeout here. Jason, it's been a pleasure having you on here and learning from your experience here. Audience, I would highly recommend you go check out everything Jason's doing. Posts a lot on LinkedIn, a lot of great stuff there to learn from Jason about. What's the best way for our audience to connect with you if they want to reach out, Jason?
So they can find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect there, as well as my blog, and all the resources we talk about are available at numberlionsecurity.com. So, and I hope to see folks there.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again. Appreciate your time today. Audience, of course, thank you to our listeners, and we will catch you in another episode of Zero Trust Journey.